I absolutely love summer. It's probably my most favorite time of the year. I know some people prefer autumn or spring, and those seasons are great too. But for me, there's just something relaxing about a warm summer day. Almost every year or so, a few of my friends and I have a little get together. We all take some time off from work and plan some sort of event. Last year was Eric's world famous barbecue party. Everything was great, until Eric set a stack of paper plates on fire, and those blew into the various tablecloths we had arranged. We managed to curtail the fires before they had time to spread any further, but that didn't deter the fire department from showing up anyway. The year before that, Jimmy invited us over to his house for a pool party of sorts. He has a very nice in-ground pool. None of us swam in it. We mostly just hung around his minibar drinking and generally carrying on. Nothing outrageous happened during that party. Oh wait, never mind, I forgot. Eric wanted to show off his mega super awesome cannonball, but slipped before reaching the water, and ended up cracking his tailbone before sliding into the water like a blob. Don't run next to pools, kids. I could go on and on about all the events we've experienced in the past, but I'm here to talk about what happened during my event last month. Like I mentioned previously, we had all taken some time off work, and it was my turn to decide what we'd all do. We usually didn't take turns choosing like this, but no one seemed to come up with a different plan. I had been browsing through different destination spots and activities around my area. After searching for around an hour or two, I stumbled across a rather interesting post. Someone was renting out a lake house about an hour's drive north. Looking through the photos and glancing over the price, I knew right away this is what I wanted to do. I called the place and rented it out for the weekend. The woman on the phone sounded oddly excited about me renting the property. After speaking with her and finalizing everything, I immediately called everyone else and told them my plan. They were all almost as excited as the woman. Eric wanted to bring his grill with him so we could barbecue one day, and Jimmy brought some fishing gear so we could lounge by the lake. Our other friend Pete tagged along with us as well. He isn't a very outdoorsy type of person, but he still offered to come with. We each arrived at the lake house about mid-afternoon. The sun wasn't quite setting, which was good as it gave us a bit of time to survey the area and inspect the house itself. The house was much larger than I expected. For the price I paid to rent it, it seemed like I had gotten a really good deal. It's nestled between the massive lake and the crowded woods behind it. Only a solitary dirt trail cuts through the tree line leading to and from the house itself. Eric was already unloading his grill not 5 minutes after he arrived, while Jimmy, Pete, and I entered the house. The interior was very rustic, but I already knew this much from the photos. Different types of mounted animals dotted the high walls. The living room area was quite large. It looked almost like a recreation hall. A wooden staircase wrapped along one edge leading up to multiple bedrooms. An expansive kitchen took up the other half of the bottom floor, as well as a decent-sized bathroom. It looked like this place was designed for big groups of people to rent and enjoy. After exploring the house for a bit, I wandered outside and took in the surroundings. It was such a peaceful evening. As I stood there, breathing in the fresh air, I noticed something strange. Apart from Eric fiddling around with his grill, there was no sound coming from the forest. I couldn't hear any birds, animals, or even insects. Hell, I could barely hear the sound from the lake nearby. Even though it was odd, I tried not to think much of it. An hour or so passed by, and after eating some burnt steaks Eric so graciously made for us, we each retired to our respective bedrooms. Sleeping in a new place always made me feel a bit nervous. I may be the only one, but whenever I'd stay in a hotel or at a friend's place, it always takes me forever to fall asleep, at least during the first night. This isn't really a major issue and it doesn't keep me from traveling, just an odd quirk, I guess. The bedrooms were quite nice, minimal yet decent. It had a small wooden framed bed, a stout dresser, and a nightstand with a small lamp. An empty closet adorned the wall adjacent to the door, and on the far wall was a long window that overlooked the trees and the lake. I was lying there, letting my mind wander as my eyes danced around my room. I wasn't staring at anything in particular, just trying to take in my surroundings so I could fall asleep more easily next time. Minutes slowly ticked by, and I started to feel my eyelids close, before a faint bit of movement out of the corner of my eye caused me to open them once again. I couldn't be sure, but I thought for a split second I saw someone standing outside my window. But that couldn't be possible as the bedrooms were on the second floor and it was a straight drop down to the dirt below. My eyes locked onto the window, but after focusing for a bit, there was nothing out of the ordinary. The next day, we all got up bright and early. There wasn't a whole lot to do aside from wander around the property, so that's what I did. Eric was already prepping some food while Pete and Jimmy had started day drinking. I stood outside on the wooden porch with a cup of coffee, looking out to the tree line nearby. I once again let my eyes drift around as I sipped my coffee. Once again, there was hardly any sound, which I still thought was odd. I wondered why it was so quiet in the woods, a place that is often filled with the sounds of life. As my eyes drifted, I spotted a bit of movement in the distance. It looked like something large moving quickly through the trees. I thought it might have been a bear, but before I could adjust my gaze, whatever it was had disappeared further into the trees. The rest of the day was uneventful. We spent most of the time down near the lake, drinking and fishing. Eric cooked up some burgers which surprisingly weren't terrible. And before we knew it, the sun had faded. We all went to our bedrooms for the night and I didn't have much trouble falling asleep this time. Around 10 minutes after I had drifted off, I was startled awake by the sounds of screaming. My eyes cracked open, and I sat up looking around in the darkness. It took me a minute to recognize the voice. It was Jimmy. As I opened my bedroom door, I saw Eric opening his as well. We each gave each other a confused look before going to Jimmy's door and knocking. After receiving no answer, I opened his door. Jimmy was sitting on the floor wide-eyed, covered in sweat. I asked him what was wrong, however, he wouldn't turn to look at me. His eyes seemed to be fixed on something else. Eric and I both glanced over in unison towards his window. When we did, I heard Eric over my shoulder shout, "What the hell is that?" I didn't say anything. I just felt my muscles tighten. On the other side of Jimmy's window was a figure. It wasn't anything I had ever seen before. With the faint bit of moonlight outside, I could just barely see its face. I know this is going to sound very weird, but its face was almost dog-like in appearance. It had a long snout and beady, hollow eyes. From what I could tell, its body was completely hairless. I'm not sure if it was just the moonlight outside or what, but its skin was a dark gray color with a bluish tint to it. Its eyes continuously darted from each of us, like someone hopped up on caffeine. It was unsettling how jittery this thing was. It felt like an eternity of all of us sitting there watching this thing watch us. Then, it started to descend from the window. Jimmy and Eric didn't move a muscle. Yet, for some reason, I felt drawn to the window. I peered outside and saw it. Despite its massive size, it crawled down the side of the house like a spider. It crawled on all fours as it made its way to the ground below. Its hands were strangely human in appearance, but its hind legs were animalistic, like a dog or maybe a wolf. Its head turned back to look up at the house, and I could just faintly see its beady eyes darting around before it took off into the woods, disappearing beyond the darkened tree line. Eric, Jimmy, and I all sat there staring at each other for a few moments, before Pete came stumbling into the room asking what was going on. None of us said anything, and we all went back to our rooms. I doubt either of us slept a wink that night. The following day, as we all packed up to leave, I couldn't help but stare at the strange footprints in the dirt leading off into the woods. What made me nervous wasn't the fact that these footprints confirmed that what we saw that night was real, but there were at least 10 more identical yet separate tracks leading off in various directions. It's been close to a month since then, and I've just tried to forget about the whole event. I still have no idea what that thing was, but I doubt I'll be renting any more houses in the woods. I had just recently moved into a brand new house. After living in various apartments during the better part of a decade, I was finally ready to get a place of my very own. I had spent the last 2 years saving up my money just to make that a reality. During the last few months of my search, I had browsed multiple property listings, as well as contacting a plethora of realtor companies. I had looked at probably 50 houses in the area I had specified, but sadly, none of them seemed to feel right. Feeling defeated, I was almost ready to once again resign another year of my life to living in an apartment. However, before that happened, I found a recently posted listing which I hadn't seen before. After making a few calls and taking a look at the place itself, I was sold. Was it my dream house? No, of course not. Was it in my preferred area? Nope. But it was quite a bit lower than my budget and it seemed nice enough. It was a standard 3-bedroom house with a rather nice front and backyard. It wasn't anything special, but I truly didn't need special. I just wanted a place to call my own. I had finalized all the paperwork about a month and a half before my apartment lease was up. This was a major plus, as it would give me a lot of time to arrange movers and not have to rush. I'm not sure if you ever had to move out of a place at the last minute before, but it sure isn't fun. During the end of that month, I had hired some movers because screw lugging around all that stuff I've accumulated over the years myself. The movers were very efficient in packing and loading everything. Within the span of a few hours, everything had been loaded onto a truck, and we were on our way to my new house. I had arrived first, and when I pulled up to the house, I had noticed something strange. My neighbor across the street had a couple of police cars in their driveway. As I stood outside and waited for the truck to arrive, I saw who I assumed to be the homeowner, as well as a few other neighbors who had wandered outside. I casually sauntered over to a nearby neighbor. After introducing myself, I asked what had happened. They told me that apparently someone had broken into their house and had taken quite a few expensive items. When I heard this, I was shocked. I knew I wasn't in the best part of town, but I wasn't anywhere near the worst part of town either. I thanked the neighbor for telling me just as the moving truck was pulling up. For the remainder of the day, the movers unloaded my things and set up my larger furniture before leaving. I had never considered home security before. I always thought door and window locks were enough to keep out any would-be intruders, but after speaking with the other neighbors, that seemed to be the case for the ones across the street. I guess if somebody is desperate enough, locks won't truly keep them out. While I was still chatting with one of the neighbors, they mentioned in passing that they were thankful for their home security system, and that's what gave me the idea in the first place. Over the next few days, I had researched quite a bit and I found that purchasing and installing your own security is quite simple. I had gone to my local electronics store and after browsing for a few minutes, I found exactly what I needed. It was a home security kit that came with multiple door and window sensors, an alarm pad, as well as one of those nifty doorbell video cameras. I had heard about these before, but like I mentioned, home security wasn't at the top of my mind, especially since I lived in apartments for 10 years. I made my purchase and quickly rushed home to set up my new gadgets. The sensors and keypad were easy enough to set up. The doorbell itself, though, took a bit of time, but after about an hour or so, I finally managed to get everything in place. The way the doorbell camera worked was that anytime anyone would approach my door, a motion sensor would activate the camera. The camera would then send a live feed to my smartphone where I could observe from the safety of my house. If someone rang the doorbell, I could connect to it and speak with the person directly through my phone. Technology never ceases to amaze me. So, after all that had been set up, I continued on with my life. Everything progressed normally as it always had. I'd get up, eat breakfast, go to work, come home, relax, go to bed, and repeat. Not a very amazing or interesting life, I'll grant you, but it's enough for me. Over the last month, however, something strange started happening with my new doorbell camera. I had 2 days off from work, and during this time, I tend to stay up later than usual watching TV and movies. It was already nearing 2 a.m. when my phone buzzed on the nightstand nearby. I glanced over at it, wondering who in the hell could be texting me at a time like this. I picked up my phone and unlocked it. An alert greeted me, saying that motion had been detected at my front door. I opened the app and the video feed filled the screen. I stared for a few minutes trying to discern what had caused the alert, but I couldn't see anything. I thought perhaps a bug had crawled or flown near the sensor and set it off. I closed the app and continued watching TV until I eventually fell asleep. A couple days passed without issue until once again I was lying there mindlessly watching a rerun on TV when my phone buzzed lightly. I picked it up and glanced down once more. That same alert appeared. I noted that the time was fairly close to the previous alert. I opened the app and looked at the tiny screen. Nothing. I was starting to think that this device was somehow faulty or that I had installed it incorrectly. I closed the app and ignored it, deciding to inspect the device the following day. And that's precisely what I did. After I had gotten up and had gotten ready for the day, I went out and stood in front of my doorbell camera. The moment I did, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, opened the app, and I could see myself standing there staring at my phone. Everything seemed to be functioning properly. I once again tried to rationalize it as some type of insect or possibly a car driving by that set it off. These occurrences happened quite frequently during the month, always happening at the very early hours of the morning. Most of the time I'd sleep through my alerts, but I'd still find them waiting for me when I wake up, letting me know that something had occurred. Then, a couple of days ago, it happened once more. I was in the process of making myself a late-night snack in the kitchen when my phone resting on the counter buzzed to life. I stopped making my sandwich to look at my phone. "Motion has been detected at your front door," it read. I sighed for a bit when I decided to physically check my front door. I walked through my kitchen, steadily making my way towards the door. The way my front door is set up, it has decorative glass adorning the sides. Not really the best for looking through, but it was something. As I approached, I leaned against my wall and looked out towards my porch light illuminating the surrounding area faintly. As I glanced over, however, I saw something that made me seize with anxiety. Somebody was standing on my front porch. From the angle with which the glass windows were set, it was hard to tell who exactly it was, but they stood on the other side of the door as clear as day. This took me by surprise, and I quickly pulled my phone out and opened the app. I was thinking maybe this was a different occurrence from all the previous times. However, as the video feed opened on my phone and I glanced down, I felt my breath become shallow. Through the camera, there was nothing on the other side of my door. I quickly checked once again through the windows just to be sure, and whoever it was still standing on the other side of my door. This wasn't possible as the way my camera was set up. It captures everything in front of my front door, yet the feed was blank. I thought about opening my door briefly, but decided against it. I didn't know who or what was on the other side, and I wasn't eager to find out. I simply waited near the door, occasionally peeking out of the window to check if they were still there. Whoever it was stood outside of my door for 2.5 hours. Then, in between one of the times I went to check, the dark figure was gone. I still didn't open my door, regardless of the coast being clear. This event happened again last night. I was sitting there watching TV when my phone alerted me, and I quietly made my way over to the door. It was back. And when I checked my phone, nothing was there once again. However, something happened which shook me to my very core. Something which is making me consider moving back into an apartment again. As I was standing on the other side of the door, a voice came through my camera feed on my phone. It was a deep, otherworldly voice that I didn't recognize. The voice said,
"I know you're in there."
Midlife crisis. That's what I named my ship. I'm sure I don't need to explain why. I bought her on a whim, dreaming of sailing away on the ocean and starting a new life. In the 5 years since I had tied her to the dock, she'd lost her pristine sheen and that new boat smell that had attracted me to her. She was still seaworthy, but I regretted not taking her out on her maiden voyage sooner. I set sail on the Atlantic, with no clear destination in mind. I just wanted to go east, towards Europe. I'd used all the vacation days I had accumulated over the years to free myself up for an entire month. I had food, radio equipment, and a rudimentary map, the bare minimum. Then, one night, as I was sitting on the deck letting the waves gently rock the boat, I spotted something in the water. It was just a blip in the distant horizon, but one that was impossible to miss. A white shape that stood out from the dark blue expanse around me. Curious, I set down my bottle of lukewarm beer and wandered to the front of the boat. Unable to take my eyes off the shape, I pawed blindly at the top of my control console, trying to find the binoculars I remembered tossing there earlier. My hands landed on the lenses, so when I brought my binoculars to my eyes, all I could see was a streaky smudge. I sighed and quickly wiped them on my shirt and peered through them once again. I expected to see a wayward buoy or some sort of flotsam, but instead, I saw something impossible. I saw a woman walking on the waves. She rose and fell with every swell of the ocean, neither sinking nor floating. She casually strolled along the surface of the water, as if it were solid ground. I must be dreaming, I thought as I put the binoculars down and rubbed my eyes in disbelief. I was sure I'd wake up on my cot at any moment, and the surreal scene would fade from my memory. But when I pinched myself to check, I felt the stinging pain and I realized that I was indeed awake. I reacted out of instinct, not wanting to believe what I had seen with my own 2 eyes. I convinced myself she must have been a passenger from another ship, somebody who had fallen overboard, someone that needed to be rescued. I powered on the engine and set sail towards her. As I began to bridge the distance, I glanced through the binoculars once again for a better look. She wore an elegant dress, white, with lilac lace and a floral pattern embroidered on the larger surfaces. The skirt flared above her hips and fell in the shape of a church bell. The dress was tight around her waist, a corset holding her stomach stiffly in place, and squeezing her chest up just enough for a hint of them to be visible at the low neckline. Her sleeves started below her shoulders and ended halfway down her upper arms, where they gave way to long silk gloves. Her feet weren't visible under the dress's frilled hem, but I imagine she must have worn elegant heels that matched her outfit. Her skin was paler than the moon hovering above us. That paleness, along with her heavy red lipstick and rosy cheeks, made her look almost like a porcelain doll. Her immaculate hair added to that impression. It was pinned back with a rose brooch and cascaded down the back of her neck, ending just above a black choker. The choker was accompanied by a gold chain and locket that dipped halfway down her chest. She looked like someone straight out of a history book. I was mesmerized. Watching her closely as we continued along our respective paths, she towards me and I towards her, as though we had become somehow tethered together. The waves should have made her drift off course, but somehow she kept going in a straight line through the shifting terrain, as though pulled towards me by an unseen force. By the time I got close enough to see her clearly with my own two eyes, I knew right away she wasn't just another castaway. The waves at her feet were crystal clear and solid like glass, yet they buckled and rolled with the ocean's ebb and flow. I could hear the distant clatter of her heels on water as she approached. Solids where there should have been liquids. Clatters where there should have been splashes. Walking where there should have been swimming. The discrepancies were disorienting. Maybe I should have been afraid of her, but I was too fascinated, too captivated by the solemn smile on her face. I cut the engines, trusting my ship's forward momentum to take me the rest of the way to the stranger. I didn't want to risk overshooting and having to turn around. I had the strangest feeling I'd only get one chance. A gust of wind brought the smell of roses to my nostrils. A pleasant scent, if not for the fact that it masked a hint of something else. An odor that closely resembled the stench of dead rodents festering in a shed. That ripped me out of my awestruck stupor and grounded me back in reality. She was the distance of a football field away when the fear started to creep in. When the impossibility of the situation brought worry to the forefront of my mind. Who or what was she? The ship came to a graceful stop and, for a moment, I considered turning tail and running. I couldn't do it though. Curiosity, fascination, sheer stupidity. I'm not sure which was to blame, but I was compelled to stay put. I waited for her, and when she came within range, I threw her a life preserver so I could pull her on board. She caught it in her hands and held it against her chest. Air then sputtered out of it, as it deflated and crumpled into pieces. Probably from 5 years of neglect, I figured. The woman's sad smile remained. I motioned for her to go around back where she could climb the ladder to the deck. With a slight shuffle, she circled around the starboard side. I followed her to the back of the ship and dropped the ladder into the water. My heart pounded against my chest like the waves against the hull of my ship. I was afraid of her, but she seemed so harmless, so desperate for help. I couldn't have anticipated what would happen when she got on board. As she climbed the rungs one at a time, I could hear the grating sound of metal bending and buckling. I should have realized what was happening, but I didn't. Not until I saw it with my very eyes. Her hands grasped the railing tightly. The paint crackled and chipped away. The metal rusted. As soon as she pulled herself on board, her feet began to sink in the wooden floorboards. They decayed beneath her and turned to mush. Panic set in, and I screamed at her to get off, but she simply walked towards me, her face twisting as she let out a desperate, soundless cry. Instinct took over. I shoved her, hard enough that she fell over the side of the ship. So hard, in fact, that I staggered forward and tripped on the hole in the wood. From over the edge of the ship, Her hand shot up and clutched my arm tightly. I could feel my skin stinging violently, as though from a bad sunburn. With a forceful tug, I jerked myself free, but the damage was done. My skin was starting to flake off, exposing my raw epidermis. Even the cool ocean breeze felt agonizing against it. The woman pawed at the ship, her hands corroding its sturdy hull. As I peered over the edge, I looked at the bright crystalline surface at her feet and I saw her reflection. It was horrible. Her hair was disheveled. Her dress was stained with black handprints, and her face was covered in boils and scarred skin. Her expression, however, was the same. Sad, desperate, lonely. I could hear water trickling into the boat from below deck. She had made a hole. Whether on purpose or not, I'll never know. I quickly ran to the front of the ship and started the engine at full speed, then raced below deck to seal the hole. Through the cracked metal hull, I could see her following in the boat's wake, even as it raced away. She was trying to catch up, but my boat was faster. Once I finally plugged the hole, I returned above deck. Something caught my attention. An object gleaming in the moonlight. It swung from the back railing like a pendulum. Taking care to avoid the rotten wooden planks, I reached around and grabbed the object. It was her locket. Unlike the rest of her, it didn't cause any decay. I pocketed the object and returned to the control console to adjust my heading. It was time for me to head home. To be honest, I had forgotten all about the locket by the time I reached port. I was in too much pain and still reeling from the encounter with the woman walking on the waves. I tied midlife crisis down and rushed to the hospital to get my arm treated. The doctors said it looked like a chemical burn. I didn't correct them. It wasn't until I returned home that I saw the necklace again. It clattered against the bottom of my washing machine as I threw my clothes inside. I reached in and pulled it out. Inside was the painted portrait of a mustached man in a top hat, wearing a fitted jacket, high-collar shirt, and some sort of frilly bow tie. I brought it to an acquaintance of mine, a historian that worked the museum circuit. He pried the portrait loose and looked at the back. A note had been penned on it. It read, Duke E.S., 1885. After a bit of research, he was able to track down the pendant's origin. The man painted on it was Duke Edward Smith, married to Duchess Elizabeth Smith. She was rumored to be a loose woman. When she contracted syphilis, Edward had her thrown to sea, alive. It said that she swam after the ship, following it for hours from afar, before succumbing to the waves. Edward's life ended just a few years later. He was executed on suspicion of witchcraft. Now, Elizabeth wanders the ocean, suffering a punishment unfairly disproportionate to her alleged crime. She walks on the waves, looking for a ship to save her. But everything she touches withers away. She can never be saved. There are some people out there who absolutely cannot stand driving. Whether it be the traffic, inconsiderate drivers, or simply the endless drone of tires on asphalt, some people just loathe it. I, on the other hand, love driving. That's probably a byproduct of my childhood, though. When I was younger, my mother used to take me to work with her every day. She couldn't afford a babysitter, and my father, well, let's just say he wasn't really in the picture a whole lot. We lived on the edge of a major city, and she worked at a salon downtown. So every morning we'd get up and she'd drive me to the salon, which took about an hour or so each way. I'd spend most of my time there playing my Game Boy while she worked. This was basically my childhood right up until I started school. I'm not sure why, but something about those daily trips ingrained an affinity for driving. Once I was old enough to get my license, you couldn't keep me out of my car. Family friends would often tell me that it gets old, but that never seemed to happen for me. I'd find almost any excuse to drive around. Hell, the first day I got my car, I even drove to the mailbox at the front of the driveway. I know, maybe that was a bit much, but I was just so excited. Within my close-knit group of friends, I was the only one with a car, so they would often ask me for rides everywhere. I was more than happy enough to oblige regardless of destination, provided they fronted some gas money, that is. It wasn't until my senior year in high school that an idea grew in my head. One of my teachers went around our class and asked us what our plans were for after graduation. A few classmates mentioned going to college, others going to work full-time, and a couple just had no clue. One girl in my class, however, said that she wanted to travel for a bit before deciding on what she wanted to do. I thought that was a great idea. During my junior year in school, I had gotten a part-time job working in a pizza place. The job itself was fine, but it definitely wasn't something I wanted to do with the rest of my life. The pay wasn't amazing, but I didn't have very many bills aside from my car and phone. So I had been saving up the remainder over the past year and a half for a rainy day. Even though I enjoy driving as much as I do, I've rarely traveled outside my city, let alone my own state. So my next decision was a travel destination. I had always wanted to visit California, and since it was only 2 states away, I figured that was as good a place as any. When I told my mom my intentions, she wasn't thrilled with the idea of me traveling across the country all on my own. But she herself actually traveled quite a lot when she was younger, so she really couldn't hold me back. 6 months passed by with the speed of molasses. It seemed like graduation day was always one more day away. It eventually arrived, and I was finally free of my time as a student, at least for the time being. I sort of half promised my mother that I'd go to college immediately upon coming home from my trip. Around a month or two after graduation, I had quit my part-time job at the pizza place. I had packed and repacked all my things numerous times, making sure I wasn't forgetting anything. After saying goodbye to my mom, I was finally ready to hit the road. Driving away from my city was a strange feeling. It was almost like leaving a part of me behind. As I watched it shrink in my rear view, I couldn't help but feel immediately homesick. That faded quickly, however, as I continued my journey on the highway. Throughout the first leg of my trip, everything was great. The roads were sparsely populated, which made driving much easier. The skies were bright and clear. I had a full tank of gas and was listening to some good music. At that moment in time, I was in heaven. As I was driving down the highway, gently nodding my head to my music, I glanced over and saw a small gas station sitting off the road. What struck me as odd was that it was blatantly in the middle of nowhere. Usually, gas stations require a turn off the highway, or are closer to towns. Not this one. It was simply sitting there, on the side of the road. I glanced down at my fuel gauge and was still at half a tank, so I disregarded it as I continued onward. Another couple of hours passed by and I noticed something approaching on the side of the road. Keep in mind, on this stretch of road, there was hardly anything aside from flatland for as far as the eye could see. It was another gas station on the horizon. I looked down at my gauge and saw that I had a quarter tank left. I considered stopping at this one, but that was until I got closer. It looked eerily similar to the one I had seen only a few hours before. I couldn't be certain if it was the exact same one, but I wasn't eager to find out. So I simply kept my eyes on the road, hoping I'd make it to a town soon. After another hour of driving, my fuel light blinked on, letting me know it was time to fill up. The once brightly sunny sky was steadily shifting into reds and oranges as I drove. I kept my eyes peeled for any signs for a town nearby. Then, on the horizon, a building started to slowly fade into existence, almost like a mirage of some kind. I squinted my eyes, and once I could see it clearly, I felt my heart beat faster in my chest. It was that same exact gas station from earlier. By this point, I absolutely didn't want to stop here, but my car silently mocked me with my fuel empty light. I had no other choice. I had to fill up my tank. I slowed down as I approached, and I could see the station more clearly. The pumps outside were pale white, yet partly overcome with rust. The building itself was made from dark wood and brick, though the materials looked aged and worn. Honestly, it looked more like an old-timey gift shop than a functioning gas station. My first instinct was to nope the hell out of there, but the incessant light on my dashboard made me think twice about that. I slowed my car to a crawl and pulled into the station. As I sat in my car parked next to the pumps, I felt uneasy. I wasn't sure whether it was the fact that I had seen this place before, or the fact that I was the only car around. I nervously glanced out my window, hoping to see any other cars nearby. I would have even taken cars driving on the highway, but there was absolutely nobody. After taking a few shallow breaths to steady my nerves, I opened my car door and stepped outside. I walked around to the pump, hoping I could just pay and be on my way with a full tank of gas. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. These pumps were quite old and didn't have the credit card readers built into them. I paused for a moment. I really didn't want to enter this building, but I didn't have much of a choice. I walked up to the entrance and cracked open the glass door. The interior had a musty smell to it, almost like the inside of a suitcase that hadn't been opened in years. I stepped inside and looked around. To my left were a couple of shelves with a few miscellaneous items on them. To my right was what appeared to be an ice chest, and a little further down were some cleaning supplies. Directly in front of me was the main counter, and behind it stood a man in his mid-30s. This may sound odd, but the man looked like the most out-of-place thing in the gas station. He was cleanly shaven, youthful, had a bright smile on his face, and just overall looked welcoming. I nodded to him as I walked up, and not wanting to be there much longer, I slapped down a $20 bill and told him to put it on the pump. When I did that, something weird happened, and by something, I mean nothing. The man didn't move, didn't take the money. He didn't even look at me as I spoke. He simply maintained this vacant, smiling expression. I nervously nodded once more to him and walked out of the gas station. Once outside, I quickly trotted over to my car and put the pump in my tank. Shocked is a good word to describe how I felt when the gas started flowing as I pumped. While my car filled up, I kept a watchful eye on my surroundings, making sure nothing was sneaking up on me. After a minute or so, I shifted my gaze back towards the building itself, and I saw the gas station clerk again. Only this time he was standing on the other side of the glass door, his grinning expression still unchanged. But something was different. I could no longer see his eyes. The top half of his face was obscured by shadow. When I saw him, I nearly tripped over the pump. I decided I had spent enough time here already. I returned the hose, hopped back in my car, and sped away. As I drove, I glanced in the rear view and I saw the gas station beginning to fade in the distance. And something else. The clerk was now standing in the middle of the road watching me leave. Once the building was completely out of sight, I sighed thankfully. But that was short-lived as I saw a building beginning to approach in the distance. It was that same gas station again. Not knowing what else to do, I slammed on my brakes and turned my car around. I drove back the way I came, and after a few hours, I saw something new. Road signs, indicating that I was re-entering my home state. I made it home not long after that, and my mom was quite surprised to see me. I told her that I just missed home too much. And it was true. I did miss my home a lot, but not for the reason she thinks. Since returning from my trip for the first time in my life, I haven't had the desire to drive anywhere. For those of you planning a road trip in the near future, take this as a word of caution. I don't know what that place was or where it even came from, but if you see a gas station start appearing over and over again, turn back before you are forced to stop there, just like I was. A little background before I get into this, as I'm severely creeped out. My name is Chris, and I live just outside of Louisville, Kentucky. My family had moved here after my dad had been relocated due to his job. He supervises car manufacturing plants, and they just so happened to have a location that needed overseeing here. We had moved down here shortly after I graduated high school. I had been lucky enough to get a job online so I could work from pretty much anywhere, provided there was internet. Even though I wanted a place of my own, to leave the nest as it were, my parents were more than kind enough to let me stay with them for a while. I paid them rent, of course. Not as much as a typical apartment, mind you, but it was better than nothing. The house we moved to is basically in the sticks. I'm talking surrounded on all sides by forest. Well, apart from our front yard, which stretches towards the main road. Our house is nice. Well, as nice as a house can be in the middle of nowhere. My father is a big nature guy, and when my parents were choosing a house to purchase, this one just seemed to have everything they were looking for. We had lived in this house without issue for around 3.5 years. Not long after my 21st birthday, my parents surprised me with a gift. Well, more like an opportunity. My father was once again tasked with relocating to oversee a new plant being constructed in Florida. At first, they were just going to sell this house and move down there, but instead, offered me the house. I was shocked, to be honest. I made sure they were financially able to accommodate this move without selling the house, and they assured me it would be fine. They ended up purchasing a small mobile home in Central Florida. My parents told me they didn't need a massive house and would be happy with whatever I decided. I accepted, and after a few months, I became the owner of my very own house. Living alone in a place like this can be unsettling at times. I'd often catch myself glancing out one of my windows and see nothing but blackened trees swaying in the night. The isolation I felt was palpable. It wasn't nearly as bad when my parents were around. Something about that childlike assurance was enough to ease my mind. That quickly vanished once they left, however. If I had known it'd be like this before they moved away, I might have just taken them up on that offer of going along. So, it's been about a year since my parents had moved and I was pulling another all-nighter on my computer. For those of you wondering, I process pharmaceutical requisitions and forward them to the proper clients. I'm basically tech support for pharmacies. I was sitting in my room trying to make a dent in the mountain of email requests I had received throughout the day. After mindlessly typing away at my keyboard, I glanced down at the time and saw that it was 3 o'clock in the morning. With a stifled yawn, I rubbed my eyes, which had been strained from my bright computer monitors. I planned on only doing a half-hour more of work before bed, but I was in desperate need of something to drink. My house has your basic home layout. living room with an adjacent kitchen, a hallway which branches off from the living room to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. We have an upstairs loft/room where I used to sleep, but I've since taken residence in one of the downstairs rooms for convenience. I stumbled out of my room and made my way towards the kitchen. After drinking 2 large glasses of water, I placed the glass in the sink, wiped my mouth, and turned to head back to my room. I stopped dead in my tracks, about halfway through my living room. There was a door in my hallway. A new door. One I had never seen before. When I first noticed it, it reminded me of an episode of Doctor Who, where an escaped alien convict takes up residence in one of the characters' houses and hides in a room which they couldn't see. I was stunned. I wasn't sure what to do. I had lived in this house for 4.5 years, and all that time there had only ever been 3 doors down that hallway, the 2 bedrooms and the bathroom. As I stood there, I thought about calling the police, but what would I say to them? Hi, yeah, a random door just appeared in my house. Please hurry. They'd probably throw me into an institution. My legs felt fused to the living room floor. I was unsure if I was just incredibly tired or if there was something wrong with the water I drank. I took a few deep breaths, and after doing so, I regained a faint amount of feeling in my legs. I took a few shaking steps towards it. A part of my brain was just filled with warning alarms, and another was brimming with curiosity. Even though this was obviously unsettling, the mystery was just as provoking. After what felt like hours, I managed to walk up to this door. I simply stared at it for a while. It looked identical to both of the bedroom doors, which were clearly visible down the hallway. I tried to calculate the structure of my house in my mind. If I was thinking correctly, there was no way this door could exist. The exterior wall was supposed to be on the opposite side from where this door stood. So either this door opened to the outside, or someone had built an addition onto my house within the last few hours. I placed my ear near the door to see if I could hear anything inside of it. Unsurprisingly, there was no sound, other than the distant cacophony of insects outside. I could feel my palms beginning to sweat as I reached down for the knob. I gripped the handle tightly and turned. The door seemed to almost pop as it was unsealed. I pushed it open as slowly as possible, craning my neck to peek inside. From what I could make out through the tiny sliver, it appeared to be another hallway. I pushed the door open further and leaned my head inside. It was indeed a hallway that extended forward maybe 20 or so feet. At the end of it was another door which looked identical to the ones in my house. I should have just shut the door and left for the night, but that looming curiosity in my head was pleading for me to investigate further. I entered the hallway and softly walked towards the other door. I once again put my ear up to the wood, and this time, I could hear something on the other side of it. It sounded almost like air moving inside. Not so much a gust of wind, but more like breathing. My hand gently rested on the doorknob, and just as I was about to turn it, a slam sounded on the other side of the wood. The sudden impact sent me flying backwards, and I landed hard on my back. Before I could even register what had happened, another forceful slam shook the thin wooden barrier between me and whatever it was on the other side. I was so terrified at whatever it was that was making that noise, I couldn't even stand up. I just sort of crab-walked my way backwards as pound after pound sounded upon the door. Once I was about halfway down the hallway, the door crashed open with a sharp crack. I was expecting to see some large beastly creature on the other side, but all I could see was a void, black and empty. The inky darkness that filled the room beyond seemed to stretch outwards into the hallway. Seeing this, my body instinctively stood itself up and I sprinted the remainder of the way. I grabbed the knob and pulled the remaining door hard. Just before it shut, however, I glanced behind me and I could make out a shape in the darkness. It was horrific, like something out of the minds of King, Craven, and Geiger combined. It was incredibly thin, but immensely tall. Long arms and legs jutted out from its narrow torso. The best way I can think to describe it is like one of those stick bug things. I couldn't make out its face as it was too obscured by the darkness in the chamber, but I could, however, see its eyes, like two orbs of fire shimmering in the night. Its elongated appendages would shoot out from the dark and scrape along the walls, pulling it closer and closer. I slammed the door shut in its face and backed away from it. A forceful slam reverberated on the wood in front of me, and that was enough to send me running for my car. I swiped my keys off the counter and dashed outside, driving off into the night. I spent the entire night just driving around the city until the sun came up. I had only just returned about an hour ago, and when I entered my house fully expecting to see that thing waiting for me, there was nothing. I glanced around the corner into my living room to look at the door, and it was gone. What I had experienced the night before wasn't some hallucination. There was no way that was possible. I didn't have to look too hard to confirm my beliefs, though. From where that door once resided, there was what appeared to be very faint blackened scratches along my wall, leading all the way to my front door. I think I'm going to check myself into therapy for a while because I must be losing my mind. But, just in case I haven't lost it completely, whatever was trapped in that mysterious door is out now. And I have no idea where it could be. If any of you see a mysterious door appear somewhere in your house, please, do not open it. I don't think you'll like what you'll find within. My group of friends in high school are not what some would call the best and brightest. We tend to get ourselves into a lot of mischief. The four of us all grew up together in one of the more poverty-stricken neighborhoods of our city. There was Jake, always the schemer. It seemed like he'd spend all day every day just cooking up these ideas for us to do. Nate was the quietest of our little group. He was smaller than all of us and we gave him a ton of grief for it. However, what he lacked in demeanor, he made up for the willingness to try almost anything. Drew was almost the exact opposite of Nate. He was your typical jock stereotype. Hell, if you were to see him wearing his Letterman jacket, you'd swear he was a walking cliché. He was the largest of us, both in height and physicality. Teachers and students would often question why he debases himself by hanging out with delinquents like us. To which he always replies, "They're my friends." He's not lying when he says that. Since we were toddlers, we were all nigh inseparable. Sure, at times we do get him into trouble, but Drew is a super nice, likable guy, and a skilled athlete, so they usually just let him off with a warning. Last but not least, there's myself. I'm never any good at talking about myself, so I apologize if my descriptions are a little vague. My name is Matt, and I guess you could call me a jack of all trades. I had never been very good at one specific thing, but I like to think I'm pretty decent at a few. Like I mentioned before, we're pretty much delinquents. I'm not proud when I say this, but we've done a lot of stupid things. We've stolen from stores, broken into buildings, gotten into numerous fights with other kids. Now, I'm not trying to glorify these bad deeds or make it sound like we'd get into trouble every time we hung out. Those incidents all happened over the span of multiple years, and after getting caught shoplifting from a gas station once, we were all labeled as bad kids for life. That, however, all changed during our junior year summer vacation from school. Jake and I were sitting in his living room playing video games when we overheard his mother talking on the phone. She mentioned something about our old elementary school being shut down so they could merge the school into another one. When we heard this, the grin on Jake's face was chilling. Like I said, we had broken into places before, but nothing major. We'd never break into places with visible security systems in place. And we'd never break into residential houses. People often owned guns, and it was too great a risk to gamble our lives. However, abandoned places and open areas like construction yards were fair game. Anyways, Jake came to us one day and mentioned wanting to go to our old elementary school. I just smirked and shook my head, while Drew berated him for his stupid ideas. Nate, however, was ready and willing to go, as always. Even though Drew and I were both on the fence about going, Jake always seemed to have this way of talking us into doing his bidding. The dude was born with a silver tongue, I swear. So, against our better judgment, the following night we were all on our way to the school. Our old school was filled with fond memories. Most of them were us sitting in the principal's office, but they were still good. During our walk, we reminisced about the old times and how much fun we had. Before we knew it, we were already at the fence surrounding the school itself. A large sign with a construction company logo was fastened to the outside of the fence. We hopped the fence and crossed a vast field which contained 2 baseball diamonds as well as a playground area. After about 5 minutes of walking, we were all now standing near the back of the school. Drew and I both wondered how we'd get inside. We folded our arms and each gave sly glares to Jake, who stood confidently between us. He just returned a smirk of his own and told us to follow him. As we walked, he mentioned that one of our teachers from our youth always had the same room year after year, and she'd always leave one window unlocked because she enjoyed the breeze. I just laughed at how low the probability was that it'd be unlocked, but I quickly stifled my laugh as the window lifted open with ease. Jake hopped inside first, followed by Nate. Drew and I just sighed at each other and climbed in as well. Standing inside one of your old classrooms in the dark certainly is strange. Although the room had mostly been cleared out, we smiled to each other as we remembered all the time we had spent in this room. We ventured out of the classroom and into the hallway. The strangeness we felt from standing in our old classroom immediately shifted to an air of uneasiness as we entered the darkened corridor. Before any of us could comment on the creepy surroundings, Jake piped up and told us to split up. He said Nate and himself would go one way while Drew and I went the other. He said to meet us back here in a little while and told us to look for anything interesting. Drew, looking visibly unnerved at being here, didn't say anything. We split up and each made our way down the hall. How our school was set up was like a large yet simple square, with rooms on both sides. There was a second floor, but that was mostly for the higher grades as well as the faculty offices. In the center of this large square was the gymnasium. Drew and I wandered around, occasionally peeking our heads into random rooms. The entire place was cleared out for the most part. Some desks and debris had been left, but not much else. As Drew and I were leaving one of the rooms, I caught a bit of movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked over and down the hall adjacent to us. There appeared to be a young kid running away. You should have seen the look on Drew's face when I told him. It was hilarious, and yet strangely appropriate. We walked towards where I had seen the child, and I tried to joke with Drew to keep his mind off things. As we rounded the corner, however, nobody was there. Drew let out a massive sigh, but his breath instantly re-entered his body when we heard a shriek coming from down the hall. It sounded like Nate. Instantly, Drew and I sprinted down the hallway, our footfalls echoing off the linoleum below our feet. We almost slid into a wall of lockers trying to halt our momentum, but when we finally stopped, we glanced over and saw Nate shaking on the floor. We tracked his gaze and saw what had scared him. There was a little boy standing only a few feet from him. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but something was clearly off about this kid. His skin was paper white and had almost translucent hair. His eyes, however, were jet black, like two spheres of onyx placed into his skull. I slowly walked over to Nate and helped him stand up. His entire body shook involuntarily as I tried to steady him. I asked him where Jake was, and he said that he didn't know. Before I could question any further, Drew violently tapped me on the shoulder. I looked over and down the hall we just came from. There were 2 more children, a little girl and another little boy. They both were clearly different from the one in front of us, but strangely similar. The unifying feature they all possessed, however, were those empty black eyes. What was most jarring to me was how they were moving. They'd both take a step, then vanish from sight, only to reappear a few feet closer. I spoke firmly at Nate and asked him once again where Jake was. He said that when he entered one of the rooms, Jake was behind him, and when he came out, Jake was gone. He turned the corner and saw that boy, and then saw us. I called out down the hallway for Jake, but my voice seemed to echo only for a little bit before dying out. I told Nate and Drew that we needed to get out of here. They both just gave me a look of betrayal yet understanding. We ran past the singular boy Nate had encountered, and for the briefest of seconds I thought we were going to die. That surprisingly wasn't the case, however, as we sprinted past. As we ran, I continuously called out for Jake, but still no response. Eventually, we arrived outside the room we had entered. When we entered the room to leave the school, I saw something in the corner of the room. It was Jake, cowering in a ball. I walked over to him and demanded an explanation. He just trembled with a vacant look on his face. I pulled him to his feet, and one by one we all climbed out of the school. I was the last one out of the building, and as I pulled myself through the window, I glanced behind me. The entire classroom was now filled with children, their black eyes watching us all intently, like sharks in the water. It's been a little under a year since that night, and during that time we've all steadily drifted apart. I tried my best to keep us all friends, but Nate had gotten a girlfriend, which was surprising, and she took up most of his time now. Drew immediately threw himself into sports, focusing more on the team than on us. And finally, Jake, well, Jake just doesn't talk to anyone much anymore. It might sound strange, but I had repressed that night right up until graduation day. Then, as I watched Jake awkwardly walk along the stage and receive his diploma, for the faintest of seconds, I could have sworn his eyes were jet black. I glanced over at Nate and Drew sitting a few seats away. Nate was pale white, his hand gripping his girlfriend's tightly, and Drew had sweat dripping from his brow as he stared at the floor. To this day, I have no idea what those kids were. Either ghosts or demons or something else entirely. I just hope the demolition of that school was enough to make them disappear. But just in case it wasn't, and they are still out there, stay away from the children with black eyes before you end up just like my friend Jake, or worse. There is no such thing as Area 51. Sorry. And the fact that it's the golden egg of conspiracy theories worldwide is exactly what the US government wants. I'm writing this in a bit of a rush, and I don't have any of my thoughts organized, so I'm just going to break it down as follows. Groom Lake, Paradise Ranch, Edwards Air Force Extension, Restricted Training Facility UX-104. These are a few names for the place you know as Area 51. I don't know much about its history, but essentially it was intended by the US Air Force to be a secret weapons testing facility during the Cold War. It had a few on-site extensions. One of them was for developing experimental rocket and jet engines. One was for training contingents of troops for nuclear warfare and post-apocalyptic survival. But much like the third Star Wars movie, the site and its purpose got out around the same time as the Roswell incident, and the subsequent media frenzy popularized the base. The government at first tried to quell the speculation about it, but soon adopted another strategy: feed into the hype and simply move the base a few dozen miles away. Today, Groom Lake, Area 51, is a small but functional military airport and base. It's got a few bunkers mostly housing low-security servers, and some munition tests are performed there. Staff are regularly moved in and out, mostly folks who are low on the totem pole and trying to climb up the ladder to the real facility. There are some very outdated nuclear fallout shelters that are still maintained and used for storage. The facility consumes an enormous amount of power, and everything possible is done to make it look like a well-guarded military base that is engaged in some huge secret operations. The employees really do fly in there every day from Las Vegas on conspicuously inconspicuous jets marked as Janet, sometimes referred to as just another non-existent terminal. And they want you to notice, and they want you to wonder. They want you to wonder where those jets are going, and they never want you to spend 1 second thinking about where those jets came from. This is the most exciting part, because as far as I can tell in my limited and clandestine researching, nobody has ever divulged the real secret before. It's pretty highly guarded, and they straight up murder people who are stupid enough to share it. Murder isn't even the right word for it. They erase people from existence, sometimes entire families. That's why the government freaks out when they find out that one of their employees is terminal and has nothing left to lose. Like myself. It's why if you're an employee there, you only see their doctors, so that they know about your health before you even know about it. They want you to die real quick of a sudden heart attack, so that you never have a moment to think about how you might do a public service and air out their dirty laundry. And they sometimes induce those heart attacks when they determine you to be an HMT, or health-motivated threat. But I didn't need to see a doctor to know that I'm suffering from the same malignant tumor that killed my father, glioblastoma multiforme. Every 3 months we get a health evaluation, and every 6 months we get a CAT scan. I simply didn't report the very damning symptoms this past eval, and I'll probably be gone before they can scan me next. I really want to do this instead. Maybe just to be the first, I guess. The only other thing I've ever done with my life is fix computers. The real secret military base is McCarran International Airport in Las Vegas. The history of the airport was always bound up in military involvement. Before and during World War II, the Army Corps of Engineers and the Air Force were building, storing, training, and doing all sorts of things there. Basically, the government and its corporate benefactors in the military-industrial complex, of course, acquired full ownership of the airport around the time Area 51/Groom Lake exploded in the public eye. It was a rush job and a simple solution. For all intents and purposes, McCarran is an airport. It moves civilians in and out and all over the world just like any other airport on Earth. But its subterranean operations are really something else entirely. First of all, you have to understand the structure of this military base. Because it serves ostensibly as a business of public transportation, every single aspect of this base has dual functions. This is called masking, and it is deployed with remarkable effectiveness at McCarran. To name a few examples, the constant takeoffs and landings of airplanes provide sound camouflage for cutting-edge engine testing. The public completely ignores these sounds and dismisses them as standard cacophony of airports. Some of the jets themselves are even equipped with the technology under test, while others are used to transport hundreds of government employees dressed as vacationing civilians. At any given time in McCarran, up to 6 of the gates are filled with employees of the highest echelons of the US military and government. They sit around on their iPhones, dressed as college kids in their pajamas, or weary businessmen, and they are paid to look the part. The entire base is heavily guarded by plainclothes soldiers, military police, tactical specialists, counterterrorism forces, and all kinds of soldiers scurry about the airport dressed like cops, airport security, and desk attendants. Their weapons are usually concealed sidearms. The real firepower is packed by the boys waiting around underground. Assault rifles and armor-piercing weaponry is stored around the airport's public spaces in various places. It's not hard to do, because nobody is actually looking for it. And of course, they hire a good number of civilians to work the TSA and other positions. This is called mixing, and it's necessary. What kind of an airport would never post any job listings? Have you ever watched the mechanics ducking in and out of airplanes outside, or seen your luggage loaded onto the planes as you board? Well, all of that cargo transport activity acts as a cover for the mass movement of special forces, lab equipment, military hardware, exotic building materials, etc. It's not hard to do. They drive one of those rigs by with all the luggage spilling out of it, and then you instinctively don't question what's on the other 4 rigs behind it. We even have mix-ups and spills occasionally, and nobody even bats an eye. You're always exposed to some level of radiation while flying, and McCarran, by the way, is why the standard of safe exposure is set where it's at. But excess radiation from weapons testing is vented out into the earth and out of the nearby desert. Having an airport to explain the radiation is an effective means of ridding the base of noisy folks with Geiger counters. But the true genius of this top-secret military installation is at the largest scale. The base was built under an airport because of the enormity of its power consumption, but it consumes a lot more power than a regular airport. So it was built in a city that consumes a tremendous amount of power, Las Vegas. So the base is hidden from view, even on the power grid. Area 51? Not so much. And that's its purpose. So if Area 51 is the distraction, then what do we call the real one? It has many names, but it's usually referred to as the Nexus. That's an acronym, but not many people know what it means. Not even me. Everything about the Nexus, from its operation to its structure, is compartmentalized. That means everything is need to know, and virtually nobody knows anything more than their own specific task. You could work in an office in the Nexus doing something like accounting, and never have one single clue what the woman next to you does, or the guy down the hall. They say not even the president knows exactly what goes on there, just a few generals and some dudes in the CIA. The business culture here is insane. It's like North Korea. Everyone is smiling, everyone is fine, and everyone is happy to say just a few phrases about what it is they do, when we're allowed to socialize, which isn't much. Every line is bugged. Every room has a camera in it, and nobody knows who's watching or listening or when. So that makes you think. Nobody here is telling me the truth about anything, not even the guy I share an office with. I wonder if any of us know why we are here. People you've worked with for a long time will suddenly get reassigned or have a medical emergency, and you'll never see them again. And nobody will remember that person, no matter how many people you ask. I actually got hired to do some programming for the Navy when I was in my early 20s out of college, and then got sent to Groom Lake to do some server tests. They liked my IT and networking skills, so after a series of strange psychological tests, and mountains of non-disclosure agreements and background searches, I got offered a job at a facility near Las Vegas proper. Here are a few stipulations of that job, by the way. It's a $1.5 million after-tax lump sum, plus a $220,000 a year stipend. Housing, car, medical paid for. But psychological breakdowns, anxiety attacks, grave health conditions, and family issues void the contract. I also sign approximately 2 new non-disclosure agreements per week, most of which read under penalty of death somewhere. Employees aren't allowed to leave the grounds for 5 years, and we all live underground. Term of service is 5 years, then 4 spent in debriefing, wherein we get to live in Vegas but report to another facility 4 days a week. We are discharged and observed for the rest of our lives. Our passports are permanently void, and we cannot ever leave the continental US. I heard a statistic somewhere that 20% of former employees take their own lives. I don't know if it's true or not. The base is underground. It's a network of large structures called hives, which form what is called the colony or the Nexus. We make a ton of Resident Evil jokes, by the way. Except, unlike in that movie, the government doesn't try to make its employees feel comfortable, with fake forests and windows overlooking digital cityscapes. It's a dark, dreary Soviet-style labyrinth of halls and bunkers, replete with all sorts of submarine-like features, water and airtight hatches, trapdoors, reinforced blast doors, etc. The only exception are the office buildings inside where chair moisteners like me work. They look just like the office you work in, except the men with guns standing guard 24/7 everywhere, looking over your shoulder. Oh, and the beautiful, almost surreal glow of the cutting-edge laboratories that pock the lower levels of each building. I've never been in them, but I've passed by a few times. There are 4 hives to my knowledge, although I wouldn't be surprised if there were any more. I work in Hive 1. I run some of the servers with a few other guys on one particular floor. There are 16 floors in our hive, but we monitor and maintain all of the servers in Hive 1, so we move around quite a bit. I've gotten to skim some of the data that passes through, and from what I can tell, we're the most boring hive. I've compiled the following list based on the things I've intercepted in our network, and also from hearsay from the other coworkers. The Nexus has multiple networks and they're all decentralized, but there are some ways in which they communicate, and it is via those lines of communication that I am privy to some sensitive information. Here is what I know. Hive 1. Finance, accounting, operations/organization divisions, troop training/housing, and some small-scale weapons testing. Hive 2. Chemical engineering, some nanotech research, and advanced psychological fitness, whatever that means, for elite military forces. Probably Black Ops stuff and how to survive 30 years in solitary confinement at a Siberian prison. I also have reason to believe this is the hive where the bigwigs meet and live. Hive 3. Upper levels. Bioweapon and disease research and testing. If the government actually has zombies, they're here. I've wanted to make so many zombie jokes over the years, but I never know which of my coworkers are a rat. Lower levels. Advanced space travel and space warfare technologies. Particle engines and gravitational beams and the like. I'm guessing here, no real evidence. Science fiction stuff. I once saw an email with all sorts of coded language, marked AB, which is widely believed to refer to astrobiology. That's alien life. Maybe it's just some single-celled organisms or fossilized plants from some meteor. Or maybe it's something much more advanced. Whatever it is, there must be some reason it's not on the upper levels with all the biologists. Hive 4. Total informational blackout. There are encryptions and firewalls and network security features protecting this hive that I've never seen before. Not even on top secret Navy projects I've worked on in the past. I'm being very non-specific in the language I use to describe our server clusters and networks, because I don't want to tell them exactly who I am. They'll eventually find out anyway. But there's a widely whispered rumor about Hive 4. Allegedly, the most terrifying thing in the world is in that structure on floor 15. There are a few unusual things about Hive 4. First of all, none of the top brass has clearance to get in there. They access it remotely via video feed in their conference rooms, and materials are often transported from 4 to 2 for physical review. I don't know why our bigwigs won't go into 4. Maybe it's because it's too dangerous? There was one guy who worked in 4 a few years ago when I first started, and he caused the first Nexus-wide lockdown I'd ever seen. He was being escorted through one-thumpers, what we call the squads of black-booted soldiers that grant access to different hives, and he started shrieking about IDAs. I didn't hear his screams, but I heard the gunshot while I was eating lunch. They put a bullet in the back of his head before he could even finish his sentence. IDAs, by the way, are interdimensional anomalies. I have no further information on what those are. Another thing I've read minimally about are the twins. I don't know who or what these are, but they're the above top secret gem of Hive 4. It is treasonous to even correspond about them on our secure network unless you are cleared to do so, and only 4 employees in the Nexus are. I've only seen a few things about them. One was a medical record. No vitals. Unusual vocalizations that manifest hallucinations and psychosis in nearby employees, and skin that produces violent nausea when touched. The document was basically speculation that the skin functions much like the Australian stinging tree or a jellyfish. I read documents about people who worked with them as well. In 4, a woman was remanded to the psychological ward after being in the same room with them, and a soldier who stood outside the laboratory where they are being kept killed himself. Specifically, he peeked inside during a routine access, then began bashing his own brains out with the butt of a pistol, all while singing an Irish folk song. The woman who was remanded to psych was even weirder. During breakfast with her colleagues, she grabbed a fork, stood up, walked out of the mess hall, stripped all of her clothing off, blinded herself in both eyes, then somehow managed to walk her way all the way up to the first floor, where the access corridor to Hive 3 is located. How she managed to operate the dozens of keycard readers, passcode boxes, and even retinal scanners is still under review. Last email regarding her was sent in 2012, about how she sits in the dark of solitary on floor 11 psych ward, with a permanent and blissful grin on her face. One of my colleagues whom I trust told me that he saw the twins once through hacked access to a video feed. He said they are woman-like, about the same size as a full-grown man, with unidentifiable black growths dangling from their heads, like hair but thicker, and they basically float a few inches off the ground and drag their toes lightly as they move. They are utterly pale. He never saw the faces, but he claims that they appear to distort reality, or at least in the video feed, in such a way that space looks bent around them. Perhaps these are the IDAs that earlier dude was screaming about. That is all the information I possess. But hopefully the world will know the truth someday about what goes on down there, where all are basically prisoners. We have very limited and supervised access to the internet, so if you don't hear from me again, just assume that they found me out.